you need to be able to speak fluently in the policy realm and the regulatory realm, not just in the business realm when it comes to selling to utilities. Also, I would say the definition of grid is more fluid now than it ever was before. In many ways, we used to think about the grid as ending at the meter, and then whatever happened inside of the building was your own business as a customer. Today, you've got rooftop solar, you've got electric vehicles, you've got appliances that can communicate, heat pumps everywhere. You said before electric utilities, were the buyers. I would actually challenge that, Silas. I think the policies that are now in place are really incentivizing things that are more behind the meter than in front of the meter. The grid, as we think about, really needs to start becoming more interconnected with the things that are behind the meter. And that's going to be a profound shift. Consumers are going to be part of the grid, and the grid is going to be, the meter isn't going to matter as much because it's all one system.
Welcome back to the Clean Techies podcast, where we interview climate tech founders and VCs to discuss all things building and investing to solve the biggest challenge of our generation, climate change. Today we had the opportunity to speak with Mike Jung, the founding partner of ICF Climate Center. This one is quite interesting because Mike has an incredible exposure directly and through the other ICF consultants with many different agencies and corporates throughout the climate tech and energy transition space. So he offered a lot of insights. In particular, he was able to offer some really fascinating insights on how to approach, sell to, and work with utilities as a startup. Overall, it's a really great episode because Mike is filled with wisdom. Enjoy this episode, have a listen, and let us know what you think. All right, welcome to the show, Michael. How's it going today?
I'm doing great, thanks. How are you, Silas?
I am fine as frog hair. I'm excited to talk to you. I've followed you on LinkedIn for a bit now, and I'm quite excited to hear what you have to say. So let's get into things, right? Tell us a little bit about who you are, what your background is, and what you're doing today.
Great. My name is Mike Jung. Everyone knows a Mike or a Michael, so whatever comes out easier for you works for me. I currently serve in the capacity of the executive director of the ICF Climate Center. ICF is probably best known for being a consultancy. We have 9,000 some odd people scattered in about 80 offices around the world. Most of our work is focused on energy and climate, that intersection between the two. But we also are active in the areas of healthcare. We basically help governments and companies and nonprofits and community organizations do what they do, but do it better. I live in Portland, Oregon, so I'm in the Pacific Northwest. And the Climate Center that I lead is sort of like a think tank within the consultancy. We're client-facing as consultants by and large, but my job is to serve as sort of an internal client to ask the questions that our clients aren't yet asking. And because climate is such an interdisciplinary and multifaceted issue, I get to turn around and deliver the findings from the research that I commission and give it away for free to the public to advance the overall state of climate knowledge.
Interesting. So before we get too far into the weeds, I am kind of curious. How do you determine what is interesting to, like, what's not being asked, right? How do you find that out? Like, how, I asked before we started, are there any questions that I'm, missing? So seems like it's your forte.
Right. Well, the way it looks from the inside at ICF is that we have clients, from all over the world, all over all different parts of our society, and they come to us with questions that they don't know the answers to, because we build the models, we run the numbers, we conduct the analysis that results in a deliverable. And when we turn it around and give it to those clients, it's usually because they've asked a question that's sort of like, to be a little tongue in cheek. We have clients ask us, "This feels like a tail." Another client will be like, "Is this a tusk?" Another client might be like, "I think this is an ear." We're the only ones that see all the questions that our clients are asking us because they're not aware of each other's. And that puts us in a unique position to come out and say, "Let us describe for you an elephant." We have this line of sight that no one else has. Additionally, ICF is unique in that we have this amazing collection of atmospheric scientists and engineers and economists, and we have so many different disciplines in our subject matter expertise tool set that we can tackle problems from angles that very few other organizations have that capacity to tackle. And so we have this ability to be multifaceted and interdisciplinary, which is exactly what the climate challenge requires in terms of a thinking perspective. So this is something that, clients will often ask us fairly narrow questions. We wanted to weave these together and turn it around and give it to the public in the form of thought leadership.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I think that is quite fascinating. It is definitely multidisciplinary, and it requires a lot of angles, right? So that's why part of the reason why we started the show. So I think that's interesting. You have a really interesting background into how you ended up in this role. So I'd be curious, could you kind of give us a just a bit of a breakdown of the main areas that you worked in, so I can understand kind of the full scope of your background and the different lenses that you look at things through?
Sure, that's an interesting question because it actually brings me back, to an article I read as a high school student that began, "1/5 of humanity was disappointed today." And I read that sentence over and over. And I was a Boy Scout, and I thought to myself, I feel like I'm supposed to leave this campground, in this case, planet Earth, cleaner than it was when I got here. I don't know how I'm going to do that, but if I can do some small thing for 1/5 of humanity, that would be awesome. That article was in response to the International Olympic Committee awarding the 2000 Games to Sydney instead of Beijing. And I thought, all right, let's learn about China. What are the big problems facing China? I started reading up and found that depending on how you did the math, 7, 8, 9% of GDP in China was being lost every year to environmental degradation. And I thought, holy cow, that's a gigantic problem. What's causing that? And you start drilling down and you realize a lot of it's energy related. And when you start breaking down what's driving these energy decisions, the two biggest chunks are power and transportation. So I spent my undergraduate years learning Mandarin and learning everything I could about transportation infrastructure and its energy impacts and environmental consequences in China. And that was a fascinating time when I reached this conclusion, which sounded crazy to a lot of people at the time, that China was going to become a net oil importer before we knew it. I was off in my projections. It actually happened sooner than I thought it would. And having spent a ton of time with Chinese state statistics, which require a lot of massaging to figure out what the truth is, I decided I would turn my attention to electric power because electric power is by and large done the same everywhere around the world. And it's pretty well understood. So I've been working in electric power for a long time. I started my career at American Electric Power, trying to clean up, at that time, the largest consumer of coal in the Western Hemisphere, trying to clean them up from the inside. I found some alignment with some other Boy Scouts that were parts of the organization, including the Vice President for Environmental Policy, the CEO at the time, and one of the leading members of the Board of Directors. We brought AEP to out of the global climate coalition, the Just Say No crowd, and started them down the path that ultimately has resulted in a major transformation. AEP today is very different from the AEP that I joined. I would argue that the campground is quite a bit cleaner than it was when I got there.
Impact brands represent the choice to live our lives in alignment with planetary action and our values, to preserve our amazing home for generations to come. Be it through solar panels, how you travel, where you're sourcing your materials, the choices we make matter. And I know you know that if you're listening to this podcast. My name is Anna Konstantinova, and I'm on a mission to make impact brands our next paradigm. I believe that marketing can be used for us rather than against us, and I want to help you build the best brand possible so we can all pour our strength into solving the biggest issue of our time. Whether you're a founder or an investor representing portfolio companies, let's work together to make sure your brand is seen, heard, and remembered the way it deserves to be. And as a thank you to the Clean Techies community, I'm offering 20% off my newest launch, Branding Sessions, with code CLEANTECHIES, one word. We'll take 60 or 90 minutes to solve one specific problem, whether it be a naming issue, strategy development, business growth, or beyond. Let's put our minds together and move forward with renewed energy. Can't wait to hear what you're working on. Find me at anako.co. That's ANNAKO.co. Talk soon.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, there's a lot of things you've done, man, as I look at, at your LinkedIn as we're talking. I guess, one thing I am curious about is, well, maybe let's first go here. So, how did you end up getting the opportunity, and then why did you accept the opportunity to join ICF in this role?
ICF was actually the very first job that I was really excited about. I had an opportunity before me to join a team that was going to help, turn green lights into Energy Star, which is, an indicator of how long I've been at this. These were early days in the mid 1990s. And it would have required me to move to Washington, D.C. It was the perfect job for everything I wanted to do. But my girlfriend at the time was about to start her medical school career. And I knew very well that as soon as she figured out how much better she could do, I was in trouble. So I decided to pass up the opportunity to take the dream job at ICF and instead stuck around and joined American Electric Power. It worked out well in hindsight. That girlfriend is now my wife and the mother of our 3 children. But it did mean that I had this unrequited professional love. ICF was the one that got away. And so when the opportunity came up for me to join ICF in the capacity of the executive director to help start the Climate Center, really, I was able to come full circle. It's been a real privilege and a pleasure.
Yeah, that's actually great. I'm glad I asked these in reverse order because my next question is going to be early on in your career. What were some of the, I guess you could say, challenges? Like, how did you navigate that? Because I think, especially there's a lot of young people who listen to this and, people are early in their career or, midway through their career. And I come across a lot of people who are just uncertain on the ups and downs of things. And, you wanted to go to ICF and then way, way later on you went to ICF, right? So like, can you just talk about the challenges and maybe any kind of general career advice for people as they're kind of focusing on working in climate?
Sure, Silas. That's a great question. I think I talk with a lot of young people every day. I get an incoming request from someone. I think it's because I've used the open door climate hashtag on my LinkedIn profile. People with questions like this, and I often tell them that don't think too hard. Every campground could use some cleaning up. No matter where you start, no matter what part of this economy you're a part of, there is work that can be done on the climate challenge, on the energy transition. So it doesn't really matter so much where you start, and it doesn't have necessarily a determining impact on where you're going to end up. And anyone who's told you that they had a master plan and that they followed it according to script is probably lying to you, because the world in 20 years is going to look different in ways that we could not possibly predict today. This energy transition is happening. The climate challenges that we're facing are rewriting the script. So don't sweat the details. Just start. Roll up your sleeves. Get in wherever you can. I encourage people to take up public service as a consideration. Advice I got from a professor once was, listen, they're not going to pay you what you deserve, but they're also going to give you more responsibility than you're ready for. So what a great opportunity to learn, to become useful, to build up a base of knowledge and build up a network of relationships early in your career. Public service, I think, is a fantastic place to start, whether it's a legislature or a utility commission or working for any public official. I encourage people because I think that's often overlooked. A lot of folks kind of want to start as like, the boss of something. But maybe the best place to start is to be the guy or gal that writes the first draft instead.
Yeah. No, I think that's actually really interesting. So this is something I've tried to tell people that I bump into a lot, is that they all want to, get to an in-house sustainability consulting role at a REIT or a corporate or something, right? They all want to work at Meta. But I like to tell people that you're basically putting yourself in as a very small fish in a very large pond of people, right? Who are looking, or an ocean in some cases, that are looking to get that job. But you can make an impact. Yeah, I know you don't feel like it's a big impact, but you can make a bigger impact in many cases by being the one person at your conventional industry or wherever you're working that focuses on making things sustainable. And you can show that you took the initiative rather than, being in the job. Yeah, you may not have mentors in-house. You can find them elsewhere, but, consider the pool that you're looking to put yourself in and where the impact's really made. Because if everybody's trying to get the same job, at the end, there's going to be nobody else left at the other companies to do the job, right? To make an impact on sustainability. Hey there. Are you building a climate tech business and looking for very specialized talent? Consider reaching out to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change yourself, feel free to reach out to NextWave at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page.
I agree 100%, Silas. And I really do believe it's about how much and how quickly can you learn. To be really blunt about it, no one has the answers. We have direction, we have an idea, we have a hunch, but no one's got the answers. And we're going to have to invent a lot of the details of the solutions that we're going to need. And so, beginning one's career and focusing on learning, on, absorbing, I think that's probably a better metric than, what's the actual impact that you've had early on. Impact will come as you've learned more. You'll have opportunities that bring longer levers. And so I'd say don't sweat the impact early on, really focus on the learning.
Yeah, that is quite interesting. I think a lot of people can take from that. So I appreciate you sharing that. That's good. So you mentioned it a little earlier, but I do want to get a little bit more in depth in terms of what ICF, the Climate Center, is doing. I know there's this kind of running joke about, what do consultants actually do, right? Besides make PowerPoints. But so I would like to, could you kind of like dumb this down for us? Like, what are the main things you do? Who do you work with? What are the specialties? And, what's the thesis behind supporting this area?
Yeah. Well, let me begin by saying ICF is a consultancy, but we are not your average consultants. It's worth sharing the story of how ICF got started and why ICF exists in the first place, which is that in the late 1960s, a couple of Defense Department analysts working in the whiz kid days, sort of the Robert McNamara days, the best and brightest were drawn to the Defense Department back in that era. They got together. They were led by a former World War II Air Force ace, Tuskegee Airman. That was the Black Air Force Squadron. His name was Lucky Lester. He was lucky. I think he flew some 90 odd missions and never got shot down. And they got together and they said, let's tackle the hardest problem that we see before us. And at that time in Washington, D.C., like many parts of the country, urban renewal was really kind of destroying mom and pop businesses in inner city areas. And so they said, well, let's inject some capital resources. And they also found that the consulting advice that they gave to these small businesses was maybe even more impactful into these inner city businesses. Today, we would call it social venture investing or social impact investing. And they called it the Inner City Fund. That's what ICF stands for. Literally, as letters, Inner City Fund, but also in terms of the meaning, the purpose of ICF, which was let's tackle the hardest problems we see. Let's find the places where we can make the biggest impact. Let's apply the smarts that we have to solve the problems that need to be addressed. And since then, ICF has gone on. We helped. We were there when the Department of Energy was first getting up and running. We helped the United States Environmental Protection Agency do the first sea level change analysis ever. We've been doing climate and energy since there was climate and energy work to do. Consulting really involves when agencies or companies or nonprofits have a problem that they just don't know the answer to, or have a program that they need help implementing. They come to companies like ICF because oftentimes we have specific subject matter expertise that it just doesn't make sense for agencies or companies to keep in-house. I mentioned before, we've got atmospheric scientists and computer modelers and engineers and economists and whatnot. We've got very specific sets of skills that scale as consultancies, but wouldn't make sense within agencies or companies. They ask us questions. We build models. We run numbers. We conduct analysis. We crunch the numbers, and we give them back our best estimation of what the answer is that they're looking for. It's a relationship. It ends in a deliverable, but really oftentimes it's a relationship. Our clients we've been working. We've done the National Climate Assessment, supported this is like the U.S. scaled down version of the Intergovernmental IPCC report. We've done that, program for years and years and years. The fifth assessment is about to come out. These happen every 5 years. So these are long-term relationships in many cases. These are not transactional. Sometimes they are, but oftentimes I think the best ones are examples of projects that live on and programs like Energy Star that have fundamentally transformed the way we think about energy appliances. Our role as consumers and participants in this moment.
Hey there, thanks for listening to this episode. If you made it this far, it's likely that you're enjoying the show, so I wanted to ask your help. If you're enjoying it, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts and share with somebody in the same industry who might find this interesting. And if you're interested in getting summaries of these episodes, go subscribe to our newsletter that comes out on LinkedIn and Substack. Links can be found in the description. Thanks for your help in growing the reach of this show. Yeah, this is good. I mean, it's really nice to see, I guess, some examples of how places like ICF are behind some really big kind of changes, and they are there helping make sure these things happen, right, to a large extent. This is maybe slightly off of the topic, but I am really curious to get your thoughts perhaps on as a consultant, you mentioned earlier, people asking, is this a part of an elephant, but they don't know it's an elephant, right? And then you can put the pieces together. So from the perspective of taking in a lot of information across a wide spectrum of things, how does a consultancy, beyond just, consulting fees on projects, take this broader set of information and data that they're learning from and actually monetize it, right? And especially kind of curious to hear if you want to share any examples of some of the reports you guys have done or things regarding climate. But I also want to know from a kind of commercial perspective, how you take that and you maximize it, because there's a lot of info, right? Some of the biggest businesses in the history of business have been information based.
That's a good question. I will share first that, my role at ICF is leading the think tank within the consultancy. So I'm not an expert on, what the world looks like for our consultants, but I am, I work with them every day, so I can share a little bit about what it looks like from my perspective. The thing that I think makes ICF unique, and then I'll talk about sort of the generalities within the consulting world, perhaps. First is that ICF is, we're a publicly traded company. We're listed on stock exchange. So we have all the rigor, all of the discipline, all of the urgency of a private corporation. We're a for-profit entity. At the same time, that's combined with all of the mission, all of the purpose, all of the values that I shared when I talked about the founding and the origin story of ICF. All of that kind of purpose and mission of a nonprofit, and married together, I think that's what you end up with ICF. That I think sets it apart from a lot of the sort of the management consultants and sort of the hired guns that you'll have out there. There are a lot of consultancies out there that they're just trying to figure out how do I fire people and blame someone else for it? Oh, the consultant told us to do it. How do I cut costs? How do I squeeze more profit out of this product? That's not what ICF is about. Our job really, as we see it, is to help agencies, help companies, accomplish a worthy goal, but do it faster, or do it better, or do it cheaper. But it's towards some higher purpose. A lot of it is pretty technical. ICF is, we're a bunch of quant jocks. We're a bunch of scientists and mathematicians in many ways. The Montreal Protocol, which was the ozone layer agreement to address ozone layer depletion in the 80s. We were brought on by the United States Environmental Protection Agency to organize and put together the technical analysis that underpinned the actions that we took at a policy level to fix the ozone hole. That has since grown, the Kigali Amendment, recognizing that the ozone hole is part of the biosphere that ultimately is part of the climate system. And so, we fill a lot of technical gaps that governments, need to do the work that they do. When it comes to commercial clients, a lot of times they, have this directional sense of we want to do the right thing when it comes to environmental and social government, ESG. But we don't know how to do that. Well, we've been doing the national, greenhouse gas inventory since the beginning, and so we know better than almost anyone else how to do the carbon accounting. And so what we've done for the United States has built up a skill set that is very transferable to corporate entities that are trying to reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions, for example, and improve their own ESG performance in any number of other ways. So that's a couple of examples of how we do what we do, why we do what we do, and how it all fits together.
Mm-hmm. Hey there, thanks for listening to this episode. If you made it this far, it's likely that you're enjoying the show, so I wanted to ask your help. If you're enjoying it, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts and share with somebody in the same industry who might find this interesting. And if you're interested in getting summaries of these episodes, go subscribe to our newsletter that comes out on LinkedIn and Substack. Links can be found in the description. Thanks for your help in growing the reach of this show. Yeah, that's great. I think, I'd like to move on a little bit to insights, because, I don't want to I'm realizing that the main probably value you can really bring to us, especially, is going to be inside this. So I want to talk in particular about let me just see which one I want to go through first. I'm kind of interested in the utilities topic. So on the topic of utilities, how are they approaching climate change? A lot of utilities, people say, oh, they're not motivated because they don't have an incentive to change and focus on climate. Can you talk about what they're doing? Is it just focused on renewables? How many are interested? What are the things that are on the table, challenges, opportunities, et cetera? Just kind of give us a lowdown on what you're seeing there.
Utilities are going to play a critical part in this energy transition. By and large, we're going to have to electrify, almost everything that we can, readily, and then we're going to have to figure out what to do with the rest. And electrification largely is going to happen on utility infrastructure. It's difficult to offer a generality around what utilities are doing because they're all moving at different speeds. We have some 3,000 odd utilities in America. There's about 100 big, investor-owned utilities that are sizable and serve, millions of customers. And then we have this amazing patchwork of, municipally owned and cooperatively owned utilities that serve much of rural America. So there's no kind of one answer for what are utilities doing when it comes to the energy transition and the climate challenge. That said, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act have set into motion a ton of programs that really provide powerful incentives for utilities, large and small, rural and urban, to accelerate their participation in the energy transition. We're going to have to, rebuild this grid that delivers electric power around the country from the top to bottom. We're going to have to do it a couple of times over. We're going to need a couple of grids worth of infrastructure to do the electrification that's going to be necessary to reduce our carbon footprint. The first time we rebuild the grid, we're just going to have to rebuild it because it's old. A lot of that infrastructure dates back to the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And so it's just, reached its expiration date, and we're going to have to rebuild that part of, that grid just to keep the lights on for business as usual. And then we're going to have to build another grid on top of that because population grows, economy grows, just growth. We're going to need a second grid's worth of infrastructure. And then we're going to have to electrify transportation. And that's easily at least another half grid, maybe a full grid, depending on how we do it, how smart we are about it. And then there's industry that we're going to have to electrify as well, as much as we can. And so pretty soon you're looking at 3xing, 4xing, and you start talking about carbon extraction, maybe even 5xing the grid. I hope that we can use smarter technologies and modern tools to reduce that. I think energy efficiency is going to be a huge part of reducing how much more grid we're going to need. And we're going to have to become a lot more sophisticated about energy efficiency. It's not just wearing a sweater anymore. It becomes behavioral and dynamic as opposed to static. But electric utilities are going to be, without a doubt, at the center of attention when it comes to how we get this done.
Mm-hmm. So what about for the companies? Because, we talk about utilities need to be the buyers and implementers of this technology, but they're probably not going to be the ones inventing it. So if you're a startup who's selling to utilities, I know that I've talked to a lot of investors who say, hey, if you're selling to utilities, we're not interested because it's too hard, right? So could you talk about any insights for founders on selling to utilities or building their products with the utilities in mind? Just any tips there to get that adoption and be on the same page as them, because in many cases, they're probably speaking different languages.
It's a great question, Silas. I spent a decade of my life or so with companies that sold to utilities, and you're right, it's a tough nut to crack. Not because utilities are have any ill intent. A lot of it is because utilities can only buy what their regulators allow them to pay for. And there's this thing we talk about, the regulatory compact, which is basically this deal where utilities have this obligation to serve, a requirement that they serve every customer in a given service territory, a geographic footprint. And in exchange, they are given a monopoly over delivering power in those areas. This is because it just made more sense to have these regulated monopolies than to have every house connected to 5 or 6 different sets of wires and try to compete in electric power delivery. Just kind of crazy at the time. So this regulatory compact in turn means that utility regulators, who are government officials, have a responsibility to regulate the prices so that these monopolies can't just get away with charging whatever they feel like. So there's a lot of oversight. It requires a lot of care, caution, and transparency. And as a result, utilities and their regulators are very good at keeping the lights on, at keeping the status quo. It involves minimizing risk and keeping prices affordable. That's how that system got started. Now, if you're a startup and you're coming in and saying, "Hey, I've got this brand new thing. It's going to change everything. It's going to reinvent your business," that's the last thing a regulator wants to hear. That's the last thing utility wants to buy. Their job is to minimize disruption, not to embrace it. So my experience has been that you need to be able to speak fluently in the policy realm and the regulatory realm, not just in the business realm when it comes to selling to utilities. Having a very effective policy shop that works the regulatory affairs channel, works the government affairs channel, is right up there with having a great sales team. Also, I would say the definition of grid is more fluid now than it ever was before. In many ways, we used to think about the grid as ending at the meter, and then whatever happened inside of the building was your own business as a customer. Today, you've got rooftop solar, you've got electric vehicles, you've got appliances that can communicate, heat pumps everywhere. You said before electric utilities, were the buyers. I would actually challenge that, Silas. I think the policies that are now in place are really incentivizing things that are more behind the meter than in front of the meter. There was some $60 billion for infrastructure in the bipartisan infrastructure law, but the Inflation Reduction Act puts in hundreds of billions of dollars to incentivize the things that I just described, EVs and heat pumps and whatnot. So the grid, as we think about it, really needs to start becoming more interconnected with the things that are behind the meter. And that's going to be a profound shift. Consumers are going to be part of the grid, and the grid is going to be, the meter isn't going to matter as much because it's all one system.
So then is the actual buyer, if it's not the utility, then should these technology providers, because obviously they're competing from their technology, they want it to be novel, they're not probably going to partner with other related technology, or not other one-to-one technologies or similar. They're going to maybe partner with different that also need to sell to utilities. But is there a way that you see that startups could, with this regulatory lens, try to basically get in and just prove the technology in some way to basically, I never liked this, but to essentially mandate the purchase of such technology? Who should they be targeting as the person they need to sell, right? Who do they need to convince?
Yeah, who's buying? I would say, as a policy wonk, and that's my professional training, my degrees in public policy, that picking winners and losers is usually does not end well when it comes to legislation or regulation. But really focusing on the outcomes that you're trying to generate tends to work better, and that encourages innovation and encourages competition. If you're a founder, if you've got an innovation that you're trying to bring out to this world, you should be confident, right? Like, you've invented something, you've discovered something that's going to be powerful. You think it's going to win. And so I think the best advice I could give is identify the metric, figure out the outcome that is measurable, that your product, your service can deliver, you think, better than anyone else, and try to get that into the rules. And rather than pick winner and losers, pick the outcome that you think makes the best sense for the system and for your product. The buyer is in many cases a regulator who is the one that decides whether or not the utility can buy it or pay for it. In some cases, it's a legislator who is writing the laws that can set policies into motion. But increasingly, it is the end-use customer. It's the you or me, Silas, that is deciding whether or not to put a rooftop solar array on, or whether or not to put a heat pump into place, or whether or not to buy an EV, and should it talk to my home, should it connect to my house, a home battery system. These are choices that are made outside of the regulatory and legislative paradigm. There are incentives in place, but there's really no law ever saying you have to buy a solar panel. But if it's a 30% off sale or a half off sale or whatever it might be, it's a strong encouragement. You want to make sure your technology is not ruled out. But if you think you've got the best gadget or the best widget, then by all means focus on the outcomes.
Okay, so this is interesting. I mean, I didn't necessarily plan a whole lot of questions in this area, but I think it's very fascinating. I want to continue going down this. So then if they are, like you said, identifying the outcome, that's up to the innovator to identify, right? To identify, hey, we found an inefficiency that we can help. So we're going to try to get this into legislation so that we know, somebody has to buy this outcome, and we believe we can provide it better than anyone else. So is there any kind of, just to shift a little bit from the seller's perspective, is there anything going on a regular basis where what your work is doing is helping identify the existing technologies, or technologies where the TRL is high enough that utilities should be allocating a certain amount of budget to these things, and you're kind of just making those recommendations? I'm kind of curious if it can come from not just the innovator themselves.
Interesting. The first thought that comes to mind, Silas, is in the world of energy efficiency programs. ICF works with 60 or so of the leading utilities in the country to deliver energy efficiency programs that are in many cases required by public policy. And so in these cases, ICF as the program implementer administrator, our job is to help those utilities figure out a portfolio of measures. And these are things like energy efficient lighting. It could be building shell improvements. It could be appliance upgrades, whatever it might be. And to develop a portfolio that is cost effective, that delivers on the outcome of energy efficiency and the targets that might be set by regulation or by legislation. And when we do this, we are essentially assembling a portfolio of actions that involve purchasing decisions. We're buying this or implementing that, or aggregating whatever it might be. So our job is to do this in a way that helps the utility achieve their goal, and that goal is usually something that's enshrined in policy or regulation. There's usually some cost effectiveness tests. There's usually some measures like that help us stack the options. But that's an example of sort of what we do as ICF that helps utilities achieve goals like energy efficiency. Mm-hmm. They're going to be a big part of this energy transition.
Mm-hmm. So what about somebody who's developing a new technology and they need to identify, obviously you talked about the outcome. So if it's related to energy efficiency, that's relatively simple, right? Can you do this more efficiently? But if it's something maybe a little more different, I don't know if I can come off an example off the top of my head. But are there any instances, or do you see this being possible going forward, where companies who have an intention to make, upgrades to the grid in some way with their technology, going directly to consumers first to demonstrate interest and product market fit before they pitch to the utilities? Have you seen any instances of this where they either partner with an existing company selling to consumers or do it themselves in order to convince the utilities it's worth it?
It's a good question, Silas. I'm thinking of, there's not many things that utilities buy and build on their side of the infrastructure equation that consumers have any say in or have any reason to weigh in on. It's usually big steel in the ground. We're talking substations and transmission towers and power plants. But a really interesting interface point is the panel, the electrical panel that's right behind the meter. Technically, that electrical panel belongs to the homeowner or the building owner. But it is this critical interface point with the utility's sort of last mile asset, which is the meter. And I think of this because as we set about the task of electrifying everything we can easily, these panels are going to become a critical kind of juncture. We're going to have to plug things into those panels. We're going to have to upgrade a ton of these panels around the country because a lot of them were not spec'd to supply much less the power that we already use, and it certainly would be too much to ask of them to deliver power for electric vehicles and for battery energy storage systems and whatnot. And so there may be some interesting thing that can be done at that interface point because the utilities they don't have it's not their asset, but they may have a role to play in terms of making that scale. providing additional services. Maybe there's some sort of some relationship, a contractual relationship that you could establish, or maybe a utility helps defray the cost of a electrical panel upgrade in exchange for some rights to call on assets that are plugged into that for demand response. I'm just spitballing here, but that's what comes to mind.
No, that's interesting. I mean, I think I should probably think about this more before I ask some of this question again, right? So I can maybe have a better question. But I appreciate that. I think I appreciate you thinking off the cuff there. I do want to ask about funding, but one last thing while we're on this topic is we've talked a little bit about the IRA, and I'm in New York, so we have local law 97, and I'm just kind of curious your analysis or what you've seen from a perspective of when it comes to regulation. Is the carrot or stick more effective at getting an outcome in regards to like better climate change policy?
Well, we just recently released a flagship report on how far will the BIL and IRA, kind of joke around at the office, crazy Uncle Bill and Ira, how far are they going to get us? And our best guess is that we'll get some 27% or so by 2030 and some 52% or so reductions by 2050 out of those pieces of legislation, which are impressive. This is definitely bending the curve on our carbon trajectory. At the same time, it falls short of the 50% target that we set for 2030 and 100% target that we're setting for 2050, at least in this administration. So that's pretty consistent with what the others have found, and those are largely carrot-based programs. What does it take to get that to meet the goal? And we took a look and identified kind of three big areas where we think action could make that difference. The first is in electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are taking off. They're coming online. But from the 2.5 million that we have today, we're going to need to get to something like 250 million by 2050. That's like 100.
Sorry, Michael. Can you just? I missed that. Can you just go back to the first is?
The first is electric vehicles. So electric vehicles are going to be a huge part of getting to our targets. We're going to have to go from the 2.5 million or so that we have today, about 100 times that, 250 million or so by 2050. That's basically decarbonizing our transportation sector. And that's going to be a heavy lift. It sounds daunting, 100x, but it's worth noting that our projections are that the IRA and BIL are going to get us to something like 93 million by 2050 on their own. So really it's 2.5 times X, from what we project. But nonetheless, it's substantial, and we're going to have to do a lot more. We're going to have to really be aggressive about battery manufacturing, about charging infrastructure, but we're going to have to double down on electric vehicles. The second area is on building decarbonization. We've got buildings all over the country, and we're going to have to install something like 1 billion decarbonization measures. A measure is like retrofitting windows or putting in a better lighting or whatever it might be. But we're going to need about 1 billion of these measures to be deployed across the 150 some odd million buildings that we have in this country. And so that's a pretty big lift. That said, our projections are that we're already going to be in the mid 900 millions on this. So it's something like a 15% bump above what we're already projecting. A manageable number, but it does mean that we need to keep our eye on the ball and make sure that we don't slip behind. And the last is in clean energy. We need to decarbonize the grid. This administration has already set pretty aggressive targets on that. We also need to, take the fossil infrastructure and replace it with, non-GHG infrastructure. So we need to have clean sources like hydrogen and renewable natural gas do more than methane gas is going to be providing by 2050. So these are kind of the three big, what we call super solutions: clean energy, building decarbonization, and vehicle electrification that we need to double down on, that we need to keep our eye on, that we need to make sure happen and continue to invest in. The BIL and IRA are a great start, but it is a start, and the finish line is still a long way away.
May need a stick at some point, right?
The stick carrot differentiation in my mind is less a question of technical outcome. The math is, the math works in either case, but the technical merits don't always carry the day. In some cases, it's a political consideration. What is passable as opposed to what is technically achievable?
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I appreciate that. So I do want to there's two big areas I want to cover still. So on your kind of when you look at more emerging technologies within climate tech, what is your understanding or kind of take on the funding landscape? I know that the big talk right now is that there's kind of this valley of death for the middle growth stages until they get to the big stuff where they get acquired or get, maybe they go for the IPO, but that kind of after Series A, there's a bit of a desert there, right? From a funding perspective. You have any comments on the broader funding landscape, whether that has to do with the stage or maybe, debt funding or PE coming in and doing different project financing things across emerging climate technologies?
It's a great question. I lived through sort of climate tech 1.0 or clean tech 1.0 with Silver Spring Networks, where I spent a good chunk of my career. That was an experience that taught me that, one, hardware is hard. We used to joke, we'd say hardware sucks. But also, it's worth noting that, when it comes to the energy transition, you can't do it just with software. Hardware is an essential ingredient. I think my sense is that the venture capital landscape or the overall capital landscape has matured and understands that hardware is hard, but also hardware is necessary, and that this is not a 5-year game, maybe even not a 10-year game, but we need to be thinking in terms of patient capital. This is not just a financial return. We're not just trying to get a 10x on the unicorns, but we're also thinking in terms of the impact that we make. And I find this happening in conversations that I have with folks that respond to Open Door Climate and have these conversations, which is they're not necessarily just looking for where can I make the most money. They are also thinking about where can I make the most impact. And I see the capital landscape factoring that in. Of course, they need to make a return on their investments, but the patience that they're showing and the maturity that they're bringing in, I think is reflected in how these things are coming together. No one's looking at this as a get-rich-quick scheme as much anymore. Moore's law doesn't apply necessarily the same way when it comes to sort of the big capital infrastructure that we're going to need to build to reinvent and reimagine the basic energy underpinnings of our economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think you see I believe the biggest example of this would be Breakthrough Energy, right, with their longer term horizon. I think that from everything I've seen, I've talked to a lot of funds, and they all seem to still have that 7-year horizon, right, for the VC side. And I believe that they are going to have to be more patient, right, because it's better to be realistic on the outcomes. It's obviously difficult when you have a lot of emerging managers trying to raise their funds, right? LPs are a little bit more skeptical at this point, but okay, that's interesting. No, I appreciate that insight. On the side of founders, so I want to get into ideas in a second, but on the side of founders, if somebody who's building in climate right now, given all the different things you see, I'd be really curious to know your top pieces of advice when it comes to anything in founding, whether that's finding product market fit, doing fundraising, working on go-to-market, identifying talent, just anything that you think are the most important things for companies and founders to be considerate of.
You mentioned the war for talent. I can, unequivocally say that war is real. There are a lot of choices today for people who are interested in getting involved in this work, and you've got to fight to get their attention. You've got to fight to get them on board. I mentioned before, how ICF is this mission-driven, kind of purpose-rich organization. I think that should be on the radar screen of founders. People aren't necessarily just coming for the options. They're also coming for the mission. And I think that authenticity, people know if you're doing something because you believe in it, because you really think this is going to be a meaningful and significant contribution to the energy transition, that this is going to help us get to where we need to get faster, better. Or if you're doing it because it's just a cool science problem that you solve, or because you're really out to make, a gajillion dollars as fast as you can. People know. people can smell that and detect that, and people will respond to that. So I would say, make sure that you've got not just the story right, but that it's coming from the right place. And if it's not, people will know. In terms of how to build a company, I would say there's so many technical problems that still need to be solved in this energy transition. I would say don't necessarily be drawn to what is the problem that you're trying to solve only, but it's also the story that you tell. There are, the grid, for example, an area that I know best, is really, really well built. I mean, it's the ultimate machine. It's this enormously complicated machine that has basically, worked perfectly to get us to where we're at. Anyone coming in thinking that, yes, I can rewire this whole thing and make it work better overnight is bringing in a level of hubris that I think is going to alienate the men and women who have gotten this grid to where it is. There's a ton of work that's gotten into keeping the lights on, that goes into keeping the lights on. And so to come in and say, you guys are doing it wrong, let me fix that. I think will get you into hot water fast. I've seen it happen, and I continue to see it happen. So, I have enormous admiration and respect for the folks who run the grid. And there are folks who don't always have an appreciation in the same way that I think that they deserve. So that would be my other piece of advice.
Interesting. I like that. So that's quite interesting. I just to go back a little bit on the talent piece, obviously it's my day job, so I'm a little bit partial, but I think it's interesting you say this because a lot of the candidates I talk to who are asking for advice are always like, oh, I'm looking at this or that company. I won't say which companies, but there's like a handful of them that they all want to apply to. And I'm like, all right, you realize that you are, we talked about this earlier, you're one of 1,000 people applying to that in particular job, and think about the broader organization. There are so many other companies. You just need to get a little bit deeper than a Google search, right? You can't just be going with the big ones. And it's partially an issue on the founder side, right? There is not a lot of storytelling or marketing going on, unfortunately, in the climate space. And I think that it really, that is important because there are plenty of people, I can say that want a job in climate, but they just need to be shown the way to your company, right? So that's interesting. I appreciate you mentioning that.
Silas, can I share a little secret trick that I've used myself that I think might be relevant for your listeners? I think you're totally right in the sense that, just because you haven't heard of them doesn't mean that they're not a company worth checking out or an organization joining. How do you find them is, hard, right? And one of the things that I'm always impressed by when I spend a lot of time on the conference circuit is when someone has shown up. Sometimes they talk their way in, sometimes they pay their way in, sometimes they just kind of like walk themselves in at a conference, and they have the courage to get up to the mic and ask that first question. And if you can do that in a way that shows why you're interested in, whoever you're asking the question to. So first, go to a conference, figure out a way in, get to the mic, ask a question of somebody who's impressed you, someone who's seems to be working on something that's going to be meaningful and they're working on it for the right reasons. And ask them a question that reveals that you've got the level of interest, you've got the kind of commitment, you've got the giddy up to possibly be a member of their team. That goes such a long way. Everyone on the panel probably had to either pay their way or earn their way onto that stage. The person who steps up to the mic, that's the freebie. Go out and get it.
This is interesting. Yeah, there was somebody who asked a question during Climate Week that I was like super impressed by them, and I was like, I gotta be in touch with that startup because actually the question was a terrible question, but like he did a good job of like explaining who he was, and then but the point being like he did it right, and it was memorable. So that's actually a really great hack. Thanks for sharing that. Hadn't thought of that one. Cool. So we're running out of time here. Just to get to my favorite part, the most juicy part of the show. When you look across the landscape of opportunities to, solve climate change, what are the areas that you are either most bullish on or the particular ideas that you would say, hey, this is something I thought about, not sure if it's perfect, but this is some opportunities I see to build in climate?
I'll give two answers. First is I think we have, like I mentioned before, a fairly decent directional sense of how to get a good way down the road. And a lot of it is technology, a lot of it is execution, a lot of it is investment. Those are going to need to be complemented, I think, by an awareness of equity and justice and fairness, as well as a sensitivity towards storytelling and a skill in narrative. It's one thing to say, this is the widget we need to install, we're going to do it. It's another thing to bring people on board in communities, in organizations, in neighborhoods, to understand, why it's good for them, why they should be, a part of this story, how they fit in. And so I would say the first is, on the parts that we have directional sense, let's not forget that we need to focus on the people part of the equation, not just on the hardware side of the equation, software and hardware, in other words. The second is that to complement sort of the areas where we have a directional sense of what we need to do, at least, there are a number of sectors that we call hard to abate, places where we're going to have to invent stuff. We don't know how we're going to decarbonize those parts of our economy, of our system. And those are long runway kind of challenges. And so some people might look at that and say, well, that's not going to be, the 7-year exit that I want. So I'm going to ignore it. I look at that and I think, well, when I worked at Silver Spring Networks, we always had this saying that, 80% of the costs of the networks that we build are driven by the last 20% of consumers that we're trying to connect. I have a belief that the impact, the benefits delivered by that last 20 or so percent that are hard to abate parts of our economy are going to be really meaningful opportunities that might not be obviously attractive right now. I'm talking about cement, steel, aviation, chemicals, fertilizer. Like these are difficult problems that we need to solve because even if we get 80% of the way down the road and then hit a roadblock, that last bit, we're going to have to solve it. Otherwise, it's going to solve for us.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I appreciate that. I think it is, it's my favorite. I love the hard to abate stuff because that's the reason I got interested in climate was seeing people, especially, concrete that's capturing carbon. It's about the same price and it's better for the environment. So it's like, why would anybody be against these things? And I that's why I'm most fascinated because it's kind of the reindustrialization of the world, right? Or specifically in regards to America. But I think I got time for one last one here. Are there any opportunities for people who are not scientists, they're not engineers, right? They're maybe non-technical people, but they really want to be involved in climate. They're not going to be the kind of person who has time to go back to school and learn. Are there any sweaty, I usually call them sweaty startup opportunities or kind of service-based businesses that you see aside from consulting for people to get into climate and, build kind of businesses and opportunities there?
Yeah. I'm a big believer in community action agencies. These are organizations that were brought in, into being in the era of the Great Society back in the 60s. Community action agencies, serve those kind of underserved parts of our communities, and it's a part of the world where if you can bring along community action agencies to become active participants in the energy transition, to help them to understand and help their constituents to understand that the impacts that we're already feeling from climate, it's not just them thinking that their neighborhoods are getting hotter than everyone else's, and it's not just it should their response, their engagement should be proportional to how much harder floods and fires and heat are hitting them, and they don't always have the resources, they don't always have sort of the bandwidth, and often people just don't invite them to the conversations that they need to be a part of. I don't know if this is, a terribly profitable opportunity, but I do know that it is a awfully meaningful one to engage, sort of underserved communities in the energy transition. There's a lot of places that are kind of, unsung heroes. They're not sexy, but, school buses, electric school buses. There is one that's kind of a slam dunk. Less diesel exhaust being inhaled by kids that are waiting for the school bus. And those buses can be demand response when they're not busy dropping off and picking up kids. Maybe it's not, as cool as a Tesla, but I would argue that, the impact is right up there, if not greater.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you see everyone running towards a bandwagon, look the other way. There's something else there.
Yeah, there's opportunities, especially when people's attention is focused in the wrong way. And there's just one last comment I wanted to make, which I think I've tried to say many times in the show, but I have been disappointed at how many climate tech companies that are building to solve for these challenges are really not building in a responsible and sustainable way from the people perspective, right? They're not doing these things in a way that's inclusive, and in many times just irresponsible, with massive growth and then layoffs, right? Just the kind of the old tech way, the things we don't want to be doing. So, I don't know if you have any comments there, but final thoughts, you want to close us off with where people can reach you. What's the call to action?
Yeah. The call to action is that everyone can play a role because we are all part of the problem and we can all be part of the solution. Part of it is just, being more aware of what we do on an individual personal basis. Part of it is finding opportunities to engage professionally in the work. But part of it is just, every part of the energy transition involves energy. We use energy in everything that we do every day. It could be as small as, signing a petition, writing a letter, casting a vote. These are all ways that we can exercise the power that we have to influence this transition that's underway. It can happen faster. It can also happen slower. It's up to us. When it comes to, ICF, the Climate Center that I'm leading, we're issuing thought leadership. We hope that it's relevant, not just to the technocrats and the folks who are, the energerati, if you will, but also to just, folks who are, interested, curious, want to learn. We all have so much to learn. That's the best part of my job. I'm learning every day from, the folks at ICF and the folks that, that we engage with as clients and partners. So the energy transition, we are making this up as we're going. So everyone has something to contribute because the script is unwritten. The story is untold. This is our story to write.
Damn, that's nice. That's a nice way to end. I like that. So thanks so much for coming on, Mike. I appreciate this.
Thanks, Silas. It's been a ton of fun.